It's 1858. The French show up to Vietnam and decide they live there now. The Vietnamese disagree. The French don't care. For the next 80-ish years, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia get bundled together into a thing called French Indochina, where the French extract rice, rubber, and opium, and the locals extract a deep generational hatred of the French. Fast forward to World War II. France gets steamrolled by the Nazis, and Japan rolls into Indochina like, we'll take it from here. The French collaborators are like, sure, why not? And now Vietnam is occupied by Japan, which is technically occupied by France, which is technically occupied by Germany. It's a whole thing. Meanwhile, a quiet little communist named Ho Chi Minh forms a resistance group called the Viet Minh and starts fighting the Japanese with the help of, plot twist, the United States. Yes, that United States. The OSS, the CIA's grandpa, literally trained and armed Ho Chi Minh. File that away for later. It gets awkward. Japan loses World War II, and on September 2, 1945, Ho Chi Minh stands in Hanoi and declares Vietnamese independence, quoting, and this is real, the American Declaration of Independence, word for word. All men are created equal. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The crowd cheered, and the Americans went, yeah, about that. Because France was now back, asking very politely for their colony back. And the U.S. said, look, Ho, you're a communist, or America, this is awkward. And so the First Indochina War kicked off in 1946, North Vietnam's guerrillas versus the French army. For 8 years. By 1954, the French had had enough. They picked a remote valley called Dien Bien Phu and said, let's lure the Viet Minh out into the open and crush them with our superior firepower. The Viet Minh said, cool, 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 and then dragged artillery up the surrounding mountains by hand through the jungle and absolutely flattened the French garrison from above. The French lost, spectacularly. So everyone met in Geneva and agreed Vietnam would be temporarily split at the 17th parallel. North Vietnam, communist, led by Ho Chi Minh. South Vietnam, not communist, led by a guy named Ngo Dinh Diem, who was basically America's man. And there would be a unification election in 1956. That election never happened because the Americans took one look at the polls and went, yeah, Ho's gonna win this in a landslide. Let's just skip the election. The North said, excuse me? And the South said, what election? I don't hear an election. This is where America's Vietnam problem really begins. Enter the domino theory. President Eisenhower stood in front of a map and said, if Vietnam falls to communism, then Laos falls, then Cambodia falls, then Thailand, then Indonesia, then Malaysia, then, before you know it, California. He didn't say California, but that was the vibe. So America started pouring money and advisors into South Vietnam to prop up Diem. The problem was that Diem was, how do we put this politely? A nightmare. He was Catholic in a country that was 90% Buddhist, he stuffed his government with his family, he was hilariously corrupt, and he had a habit of jailing or murdering anyone who disagreed. The Buddhist majority were so done with this that in 1963, a monk named Thich Quang Duc sat down in the middle of a Saigon street, calmly poured gasoline on himself, and set himself on fire in protest. And Diem's sister-in-law went on TV and called it a barbecue. So the CIA, and this is real, gave the Vietnamese generals a wink and a nod, and the generals overthrew Diem and then shot him. And shot his brother, too, for good measure. The Kennedy administration was allegedly shocked, and then, 3 weeks later, JFK was assassinated, 2 for 2 in November 1963. LBJ inherited the war. And LBJ was not about to be the president who lost Vietnam, so he needed an excuse to escalate. Enter the Gulf of Tonkin incident.
August 4, 1964. An American destroyer called the USS Maddox claims it was attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. And then, 2 days later, the Maddox claimed it was attacked again. The second attack, yeah, that one definitely didn't happen. LBJ himself later admitted, "For all I know, our Navy was shooting at whales out there." Direct quote. But it didn't matter. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving LBJ a blank check to go to war without ever actually declaring war. And so began Operation Rolling Thunder. America dropped more bombs on Vietnam than were dropped by all sides in all of World War II, combined. And it did almost nothing. Then came the ground troops, 500,000 of them at the peak, under General William Westmoreland, whose entire strategy was based on a thing called body count. The idea was, if we kill enough of them, they'll give up. The North Vietnamese strategy was, we won't give up. Also, we have unlimited people. The Americans had jets, helicopters, napalm, Agent Orange, and the best-equipped army in the history of the planet. The Viet Cong had sandals made out of tires, booby traps made out of bamboo, and 5,000 years of experience fighting on this exact piece of land. Guess who knew the jungle better? The North also had something else, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a massive secret supply network running through Laos and Cambodia, which the U.S. officially could not bomb because Laos and Cambodia were officially neutral. The trail moved 60 tons of supplies into the south every day. On bicycles. The most powerful military on the earth was being out-logisticked by guys on bicycles. The Americans would clear a village, declare it secure, leave, and the Viet Cong would just walk right back in by sundown. This happened over and over and over again. Westmoreland kept reporting body counts back to Washington, and the body counts always went up, and Washington always said, "Great, victory is around the corner." Nobody mentioned that the troops in the field were quietly counting dead farmers and water buffalo to hit their numbers. Then came Tet, 1968. On the Vietnam New Year, when both sides had agreed to a ceasefire, the North launched a massive coordinated surprise attack on 100 cities and bases in South Vietnam, including the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Militarily, it was a disaster for the North. They lost tens of thousands of fighters. But back home in America, people had been told over and over, "We're winning. Victory is around the corner." And then they turned on the news and saw the Viet Cong inside the U.S. Embassy, and the most trusted man in America, Walter Cronkite, went on air and said, "We are mired in a stalemate." And LBJ, watching that broadcast, supposedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." He didn't run for re-election. Enter Richard Nixon. Nixon's plan was called Vietnamization, which meant slowly handing the fighting over to the South Vietnamese, while pulling Americans out. Sounds great. Except Nixon also secretly and illegally expanded the war into Laos and Cambodia. He dropped more bombs on tiny neutral Cambodia than the U.S. had dropped on Japan in World War II. The destabilization of Cambodia would later help a charming young man named Pol Pot rise to power, but that's a different video. Back home, America was tearing itself apart. Young men were being drafted to go fight in a jungle on the other side of the planet for reasons nobody could clearly explain. The boxer Muhammad Ali refused the draft and famously said, "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong." He was stripped of his title and convicted. Tens of thousands of others just packed their bags and moved to Canada. Anti-war protests everywhere. In 1970, the National Guard shot 4 armed students at Kent State University. In 1969, journalists broke the story of My Lai, where American soldiers had massacred over 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians. Old women, babies, everyone. Only one officer was ever convicted, and he served 3.5 years of house arrest. Finally, in 1973, Nixon signed the Paris Peace Accords. The U.S. pulled out, and Nixon declared, "Peace with honor." There was no honor, and there was definitely no peace, because the second the Americans left, the North launched a final invasion. The South Vietnamese army, which America had spent 20 years training, collapsed in 55 days. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks smashed through the presidential palace in Saigon. The last Americans were lifted off the embassy roof by helicopter. Vietnam was reunited under communism. So, the thing America spent 20 years, 2.7 million troops, 58,000 American lives, 3 million Vietnamese lives, and $1 trillion in today's money trying to prevent, just